Hello guys, this is Gwen or Jason. This is IELTS review and for speaking, and this is going to be lesson 10. Okay, this is our last class, the final one. This is going to be a wrap-up. Basically today we're just going to review everything we did in past classes, all through the first 9 classes. Alright, so do you remember anything we talked about in the first lesson? And what does IELTS stand for? Okay, if you remember, IELTS is an acronym. And if we also talked about acronyms, it's a type of abbreviation where every letter stands for a word, right? It stands for International English Language Testing System. Okay, so remember to take notes. That's mostly for part 2. Of course, you should be taking notes for these classes. Anytime you're studying anything, you should take notes. Always be actively working on your English, always. At least for a number of years, or unless you change your mind and decide you don't want to learn English anymore and you don't need it. Always be practicing, practicing, practicing. I say that in almost every lesson, right? Keep practicing. IELTS is really only the beginning, right? If you're taking IELTS to go to university in an English-speaking country, you should be working on your English a lot. It could be overwhelming, right, for a foreign student to go to an English-speaking university because it's a little harder listening because it's not your first language. And question, should you generalize or stereotype? I know they'll ask you some questions about generalizing or stereotyping. I recommend you don't do it. I don't know why they still do that, but they do. So yeah, I would recommend, we'll talk about it a little more, but not generalizing so much. Make sure you study both for IELTS and to keep improving your English. If you're familiar with it, try to use British English. We talked about that in the first lesson, right? It's just better. If you know American English better, it's the same language. If you know more American English, then just try to stick with that, but do one or the other. I recommend British English. Okay, is it okay to lie on IELTS? And what should you do if you make a grammatical error? Yes, it's okay to lie on IELTS, but remember, only do it if you have to do it. Don't just lie for the fun of it. Lie if if it could give you a better answer, like on part 2. And yes, for grammatical errors, immediately correct yourself if you accidentally misspeak, because otherwise they will think that you don't know what you're saying, what you're talking about. They'll think your mistake, you think that's normal, right? So it's always better to correct yourself if you make an error. And yeah, if you make a lot of them, it'll lower your score, but also it'll lower your score worse if you just continue on without correcting yourself. You want them to know that you know the correct way to say things. Should you memorize answers to part 2 questions? Some people might tell you to memorize answers. I recommend that you work more on your fluency. I've had colleagues in the past that say, yeah, it's okay, practice all the answers. But often, if if you're not very good at it, they'll be able to tell that you memorized your answers, and they don't like that. So I recommend not doing that so much. Work on your fluency, then you'll be able to give a good answer if you're fluent. And you'll also, like I said earlier, need your fluency if you're going to study in another country. If your speaking is not good, the examiner will be able to tell that you memorized your answers. So yeah, it's possible to memorize all these answers for each section because they release the answers in advance to help you study a little. But if your speaking's poor, and they'll be able to tell that you memorized it. You don't want to do that. So yeah, it's possible to do well memorizing answers, but I recommend working on your fluency. How often do they come up with new IELTS questions? They introduce new questions 3 times per year, right? So about every 4 months they come up with new questions. Don't worry so much about that. If you could find them online, that's great. But again, try not to memorize your answers. There's a lot of questions if you want to memorize the answer to all of them. I'm going to say it. I've said it before. I'm going to say it again. Practice, practice, practice. What are your interrogatives? And why is it important to memorize your interrogatives? Who, what, where, why, when, how. Right? It's important to memorize these because you'll need to say them quickly. You only have 1 minute to prepare. These are really good to help you think about answering Part 2 questions. Which interrogative do we not need to worry about? There's 7 interrogatives. The one we don't worry about is which, because the others can answer that. Right? Who, person, what. Can be many things, but when we're thinking about IELTS, let's just think object. Where is place? When is time? Why is reason? And how, again, can be many things. But let's think from when practicing for IELTS, let's try to think manner, right? And I said some of this previously. Make sure to have your interrogatives memorized. You don't want to waste time remembering them. You only have 1 minute to prepare. Don't waste that minute trying to think of your interrogatives. Have them on the tip of your tongue. Who, what, where, why, when, how. Who, what, where, why, when, how. Really quickly be able to bring them up so you're not wasting any time with those. They're very important if you find you're not speaking long enough when you're practicing, right? Use your interrogatives. They'll give you a few, maybe 3. Do the other 3 for yourself, right? I mean, they'll give you the obvious ones that you should think anyway. So then think of the others, right? And what are your 5 senses? Okay, your senses would be sight, hearing, smell, taste, and tactile. These are not mandatory, but they're certainly helpful. They could help you give a really good answer, and even thinking of these can help you fill up time. And even if you don't need to fill up time, there'll certainly be good answers. They'll like to hear, especially if it's not sight. If you're describing something, and you tell them what you hear, or you smell, or you taste, right? Because normally people only talk about sight. So this will show a lot of good fluency and maybe good vocabulary. So remember, everyone uses sight, so try to use the others. Your senses are how you perceive the world. And I already said, describing these shows you have a good sense of the language. Tactile might be the most difficult, but it's certainly good to throw in there if you could think of it. That felt very smooth or rough or cold or hot. And often smell and taste go together. What else should you remember to do? If you need more time, remember to tell a story, right? If the question asks you to describe something, you might want to tell a story about it. A quick story can be important, especially if you're running out of things to say. Now, sometimes the whole answer might be a story, right? They might say, tell us about a time you went to a concert, right? Well, then really the whole answer is a story, but not always. They might ask something else where the answer isn't really a story, and it's okay to throw a little story in that's related to it. And what are your 3 primary emotions? Right, we talked about these before. Anger, sadness, happiness. Those are the 3 big emotions we'll often talk about. What is a synonym? Synonyms are words we use that have the same or similar meaning. And another question I was supposed to ask on the last one, I forgot. Some other words used to describe anger, right? Synonyms for anger. So we've got mad, furious, outraged, annoyed or irritated, enraged or inflamed. And what are some other words for sadness? Other words for sadness may be depressed, melancholy, broken-hearted, sorry or subdued, blue, and maybe upset or unhappy, but those can also be anger words. And what are some other words for happiness? So here we've got cheerful, joyful, merry or jolly, content, which isn't exactly happiness. It just means you feel okay. We have overjoyed. And for happiness, there's many, many others, right? There's a lot for happiness. I feel wonderful. I feel magnificent, right? There's many for describing if you feel happy. What are some simple ways to describe how we feel about others? Right, we could say we love someone, we like someone, we dislike or don't care for someone, and we hate someone. And there's kind of two in the middle here, right? Have no opinion or don't care about is a little different than okay, right? If someone says, do you like her? You might say, I have no opinion or I don't really care. Whereas if you say, well, I think she's okay, it's a little different, right? But they're both in between like and dislike. They're both in the middle there. And what are some other emotions? We have envy or jealousy. Remember, we talked about the differences between those two, right? We have alone or lonely. Again, we talked about the difference between those two. Bored, nervous, excited, confused, scared. And then this whole list that I put on one of the other PPTs when we were talking about this. Most of them are adjectives, but not all of them. The first few are nouns, right? Disgust, fear, contempt, or you could feel annoyed, proud, relieved, enthusiastic, resentful, worried, remorseful, eager, satisfied, infatuated, empathetic, aroused, guilty, shameful, surprised, embarrassed, sympathetic, euphoric, alarmed, thrilled, enthralled, alienated, mortified, spiteful, hysterical, sentimental. You could be longing for something. You could feel anguished, attracted, exasperated. Something could be pleasurable. You could feel shocked, vengeful, or hurt. So a lot of them, and that's not even all of them. What are some physical feelings? Now, some of these might really go under tactile, really, but we didn't talk about them under tactile. Hungry, right? That's a physical feeling. Or tired, or sore, or lustful, or euphoric. That can euphoric we had in emotions, but it could also be a physical feeling. Tired can also be emotional, right? You might feel tired, but you're not physically, right? Maybe you're just mentally exhausted. And what are some other strategies for IELTS? Some other things we talked about. Take good notes, right? This is mainly for part 2. Take as good notes as you can. You only have 1 minute to do it, but that will help you in your reading. Maybe for a little bit of time, repeat the question in a rhetorical way, right? So if they just say, describe a time you were in the classroom. As you start, you might say, okay, describe a time I was in the classroom. Okay, and then start into your answer. Another one is give examples. Right? This This is complicated to talk about. It depends on what you're asked. But if they ask you what your favorite movie is, you might say, well, I like a lot of movies. I like Star Wars. I like Marvel movies. But I guess my favorite movie is Excalibur. And you could always contrast yourself with others, right? If they say, how do you feel about video games? You might say, a lot of my friends enjoy playing video games. They play a lot, but I don't do that. So maybe I'm a little different. I don't play video games as often as others. And another one, don't generalize. We've talked about this before, right? This is mostly for part 3, but I don't know. I have it here in the part 2 stuff. Don't generalize. Do all Chinese people like this, or do all boys like this, right? I like to say I can't speak for everyone, but I know a number of people who do this. All right, what else? What are some other strategies? Sometimes both sides of an answer are okay, right? For example, they might ask you, I don't know, is it okay for children to play video games? You might, instead of saying it's very bad for children to play video games, or it's very good for children to play video games, you might say, well, there are some good and bad things about children playing video games, right? It can increase their coordination. It can help them get used to computers. It can, I don't know, give them something to do in their free time. Or then you could list some bad things, right? Oh, sometimes people get addicted to video games. They sometimes ignore other things they should be doing because they're playing too much video games. So sometimes, especially if you're not sure, if you can see the good and bad in something, both sides of an answer are fine. And you can compare the past and present, right? For example, do you like pizza? You could say, well, no, I don't like pizza, but maybe I ate too much of it. In the past, I used to love pizza, and I ate pizza all the time. And so when you're answering a question, you could always compare yourself now to in the past and in the future, if you think of it. And you could discuss most cases versus an exception. So let's go back, I don't know, to the video games thing, right? Are video games bad for children? Yes, they are bad for children, except maybe, I don't know, educational video games or something, right? So you could say, so even if you agree with something or disagree, you could say one thing on the opposite side, right? You could discuss most cases versus one thing. And you could discuss different degrees of things, right? So they might, I don't know, what's your favorite food? I really like, okay, pizza is my favorite food. However, I only think pepperoni pizza is great. The other kinds of pizza are just okay, right? So you discuss degrees, how much certain things. And again, practice, 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 right? I say that all the time. And what do you remember that we discussed from part 1? So remember that you could use some of the strategies from part 2 on parts 1 and 3 if you need to. Remember, part 1 should be 4 to 5 minutes. Well, it will be 4 to 5 minutes, and you will be asked up to 12 questions. Of course, you might not get all 12 if you answer the way I'm telling you to. Remember to use 4 to 5 solid sentences for your answer. Don't just say yes or no, right? You could say, if they say, do you like this? Say yes, and then give reasons why. Or explain why you like it. Or no, and then say why. They might phrase the question in yes or no, but don't just answer yes or no. Also, make a good impression, right? Smile. Seem warm. I know maybe if you're an introvert, this might be a little difficult, but it's always good to make a good impression. They should not judge you on that, but it's sometimes human nature, right? If you like someone, you want them to do better. If you don't like someone, you don't really care how well they do. So it's always good to make a good impression for work or school or any type of test. So it doesn't hurt to do that here. They should not judge you for it, but they might. don't go off topic for part one, only 4 to 5 sentences. You probably shouldn't go off topic for any of them, but part two, you go off topic a little bit as long as it's related to what you're talking about. But for part one and even for part three a little, try not to go off topic. Only ask the examiner to repeat the question if you don't understand it. Maybe, yeah, if don't answer the wrong question. If you're not sure what someone's asking, then don't just start asking. Have them repeat it. Say, I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you were asking me. So that goes along with answer the question correctly. It's okay to do that maybe once or twice. If you do it for every question, that's going to look bad. But once or twice, it's okay. It's fine. They shouldn't knock off points for that. And it's much better to understand what you're asking. I'm sorry, what they're asking than to not understand it and give a completely wrong answer. Speak loudly, or at least a little louder than you normally speak. I've got a lot of students, and most of them are female, who really have a problem projecting their voice. So practice doing that. You don't have to yell or shout, but speak a little louder. Have a nice, solid, firm voice. And when answering initial questions before you start the test, right? Because they'll say, what's your name? What would you like to be called, right? You can say yes or no for those. It's okay. Just not for the actual part one questions. Remember, once you're asked for your ID, your test is beginning, right? So if they say, what's your name, where are you from? And then you could just say, my name's Joe, I'm from Cincinnati. But once they look at your ID, your test begins, right? And so then don't just give simple little answers. Start giving bigger answers, 4 to 5 sentences. And of course, always practice, practice, practice. And what do you remember about part 3? So remember for part 3 that these answers should be longer than part 1 answers. Part 3 should be 5 to 6 sentences, whereas part 1 maybe 4 to 5 sentences. This part should also last about 4 to 5 minutes. Your answers are longer, so you should have fewer questions here, right? While part 1 is a few personal questions, part 3 is designed to be more like a conversation, but it's a conversation where you're doing most of the talking, right? Though all the questions in part 3 will be related to part 2 and kind of related to each other. We've already talked about generalization quite a bit, or stereotyping. In this lesson and in past lessons. Remember, part 3 is where the interviewer might ask you to generalize too much, most likely, right? So what do Chinese people think of that, right? What do men think of that? What do women think of that? What do people your age do about this, right? I always like to answer those. I can't speak for all Chinese people. I can't speak for everyone my age, but I know some people or many people like to do this. I don't know why they ask those questions. I honestly find it not very professional, but they ask them. And of course, remember, practice, practice, practice. And I said it before, practice your English, not just your IELTS speaking. Keep practicing your English until you're done with school, unless you get to university and you're doing extraordinarily well. A minor thing is once you pass your IELTS, get the band you want, go to the university you want. A lot of people, like if you're Chinese, you might just want to hang out with Chinese people, which is okay to an extent, but that's not going to help your English. I recommend making a lot of foreign friends as well. That just speaking every day will help you with your English. And I got some homework for you. Here's some part 1 questions. They have some about wallet and some about primary school. Do you use a wallet? Have you ever lost your wallet? Have you ever sent a wallet to someone as a gift? Do most of your friends use wallets? What did you like to do the most when you were in primary school? How did you go to your primary school? I think they mean how did you get there? How do you like your primary school? Or probably how did you like your primary school, unless you are in primary school? What did you do in your leisure time in primary school? So you can practice all these. We got some on flowers and barbecues. What kind of flowers do you know? Are there any flowers that have special meanings in China? Have you planted any flowers? Have you sent flowers to others? Do Chinese people like barbecue? What kind of food do you like to eat for barbecue? Would you like to have barbecue with your family or your friends? Maybe do you like? Did you have barbecue when you were a child? So practice these on your own. Then we got a couple part 2 and part 3. So first one, describe a foreign person who you have heard of. Heard or I would say heard of or known about that you think is interesting. You should say who the person is, how you know him or her, what kind of person he or she is, and explain why you think he or she is interesting. Then the part 3, they have to go with that. Do you have any foreign friends? And do you think having foreign friends is a good way to know other countries? Do you think it's important to know the culture and language before going to another country? What do you think of people who work in international companies? What abilities do people need to have when working in an international company? Then the next one, describe a time when you waited for something special that would happen. You should say what you waited for, where you waited, why it was special, and explain how you felt while you were waiting. And of course, throw in a couple other interrogatives if you need them. That's why we studied them. The part 3 they have for that, on what occasions do people usually need to wait? Who behaves better when waiting, children or adults? Compared to the past, are people less patient now? Why? What are the positive and negative effects of waiting on society? And always remember, part 3, they might throw in some others that weren't on there, especially if you answered those in your part 2. A good interviewer won't re-ask those, but will think of some other things to ask. Okay, I'll say it one more time. Practice, practice, practice. You can practice with your friends. Maybe foreign friends or foreign teachers if you have them. I know a lot of people. I work in China. A lot of people don't have any foreign friends, or they're not overly familiar with their foreign teachers. If you need to, you could hire a tutor or teacher for a few practice tests. You paid for this, so you don't need to pay for a new course, right? If you find someone to teach you, that's great, but you've paid for this, so when the person is teaching you, just practice these strategies. Maybe they'll teach you another new strategy or two. I don't know if I agree with all strategies, but just remember, interview. If you really need more help besides these, interview your potential teacher and just tell them you've taken class and really you only want to practice and you want some feedback about how they could answer better. You don't want to start with strategies because you've already learned a bunch. Use the strategies you learned here. You just need practice. All right, guys, that's about it for these lessons. I'll be doing some more lessons probably, but they might not be IELTS. So do well. Good luck. Thank you very much for taking these courses. Goodbye and good luck, guys. All right, take care.